Okay, 3B, this is 20 marker. Yeah, part A obviously was about the technicalities of Keynes versus neoclassical economics. So part B is about inflation. And what it's testing is, do you understand anything about inflation control that isn't purely monetary policy? Or rather, not even that, that isn't just interest rates. So as you can see here, discuss the likely effectiveness of policies other than the use of interest rates, to reduce the rate of inflation in an economy. So obviously, if you've written about interest rates, that's probably not going to end well. So what is there? What are our approaches to? We'll come back to that in a minute. What are our approaches to controlling inflation? And the answer is fundamentally we can do other demand side things. So you could talk about, for example, reverse QE. We could try to decrease the money supply, or QT if you prefer. We could obviously we could use fiscal tightening. We could increase taxes, especially direct taxes, and decrease government spending. Both of those would reduce aggregate demand. If what you then do is simply show an aggregate demand line shifting to the left and say, and therefore inflation goes down, then you're going to find it very hard to access the high levels of Marx. What this essay is all about is, do you really understand what drives inflation? So if we think about, where inflation really comes from, where it's really coming from is the wage price spiral. Somehow something starts inflation going. That drives up the cost of living, for ordinary households, which creates inflationary expectations. In labour markets, what's going to happen is that workers demand higher wages. If successful, that'll drive up businesses' costs, which will then lead to a further increase in prices. Because of that, the cost of living goes up, meaning that workers continue to expect inflation and therefore negotiate for higher wages, and therefore inflation, the inflationary spiral is established. So how might a reduction in aggregate demand, or a reduction in the rate of growth of aggregate demand do anything about that? Well, what it does is, let's suppose aggregate demand goes down. In labour markets, it makes it much harder for workers to be able to, ask for a pay rise. They're worried about their jobs. Likewise, if aggregate demand is falling in the economy, it's harder for firms to put their prices up. So what you want to be doing is, firstly, pick a demand-side policy, explain why it reduces aggregate demand, but for the very highest marks, you've got to explain why does that increase in aggregate demand control inflation. You don't have to do it this way. You don't have to use the wage price spiral, although I quite like it. But you can't just say AD shifts to the left, so prices go down. You've got to say, in the real world, why are businesses, when AD is falling, less likely to increase their prices? Standardly, people do that, and then they'll look at some sort of supply-side policy. And again, if all you do is shift aggregate supply to the right and say, so the price level goes down, you're not really answering the question. You're not showing a good understanding of inflation. So again, what you want to do is to go back to some understanding and say, well, look, okay, what might a supply-side policy be? It might be a labour market supply-side policy. We might try to reduce trade union power, or take away workers' rights, or abolish the minimum wage. All of those are going to make it much harder for workers to get a pay increase. Hence, it's helping to break the wage price spiral. Or your supply-side policies might be targeted at product markets, increasing the level of competition, privatisation, opening up an economy to international trade. Because firms face a higher level of competition, that makes it much more difficult for them to increase prices. Other things that you could also talk about, you could talk about direct controls, at various points, especially those of you who study history, will know that we've tried incomes policies where we've directly controlled wages and sometimes prices in the economy. The government simply set a ceiling. Or there have been attempts to control inflationary expectations by publishing inflation targets, making the Bank of England independent, and so on. So all those are things that you could talk about. I suspect that most of you will have simply picked something on the demand side and something on the supply side, and that's absolutely fine. There's no problem with that. They're not really expecting more than kind of two reasonably detailed policies. As long as you've made that clear link back to why is it that inflation is controlled, not just some sort of magic diagram. The key then, after that, so at that stage, hopefully you've headed somewhere between 10, 12 out of 20, but what you've got to be thinking about is your AO4. And really, your AO4 it's the evaluation of these policies. And you want to centre around, particularly, the most important thing is the effectiveness. Will it actually reduce inflation or not? Yeah, and if so, when? Yeah, so although some policies have side effects, yeah, and that's not a bad thing to talk about at some point, what you really want to be saying is, will my policy be effective in reducing inflation? So supply-side policies, it's a standard evaluation that students tend to come up with is it all takes a long time. Well, fine. Why does it take a long time? Give me a specific reason, that the supply-side policies that you've been talking about might not have an immediate effect. With demand-side policies, similarly, there can be time lags there, or it's not that easy to, cut government spending, for example. A lot of government spending is pre-committed. All of that is telling you about, the effectiveness of the policy. Some of them will also have side effects that might mean you don't want to do them. That's fine, but you do need to have something that's saying whether or not the policy works. So what we can say is, well, look, it may work, but unfortunately, stripping away workers' rights is going to dramatically increase inequality and so on. So the best answer is going to look at probably two main policies, is going to look at their effectiveness and side effects, and then probably in the conclusion going to compare the two and say, well, overall, which one is probably the most appropriate under different circumstances. And that may depend on the type of inflation, for example, that the economy is facing, that type of thing. So it's not difficult if you avoid falling into the trap of just drawing some ADAS diagrams. If you really think and argue, you can score a high mark on this essay quite quickly, I think.